So just before we start, how many of you are familiar with the CEFR? I'm guessing most of you, right? Show of hands. Okay, cool. And how many of you are familiar with the new companion volume that was published last year? One or two, but not as many. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to touch briefly on the challenges of teaching and assessing EAP before we then look at the CEFR and the companion volume and what those two documents aim to do. Then I'm going to focus on the mediation descriptors and how we can apply those to EAP. And then we'll look at some brief implications for teaching and assessment. So let's start by thinking about what we're doing when we're teaching. When we're teaching, we have to replicate the target language use domain. So basically, our aim as teachers is to replicate what happens in the real world. So that's the big circle that you've got there. Obviously, we can't teach everything that's everywhere, so we have to narrow it down. And that's the sort of middle-sized circle where we've got the curriculum content. But of course, we have like a semester or a year to teach the curriculum. We don't have a semester or a year to test them, so we have to narrow it down even more and choose a selected representative portion of the content that represents the TLU domain, represents the curriculum content, and that's what we test on. So that's why we've got the little circle in the middle there. But how do we figure out what all of that means? So the first thing we need to do is think about what is the real world domain? What do students have to do in the real world? And when we're talking about the real world here, we're talking about out in faculty on their degree course, not necessarily out in the street. But it will also come into that, and Kevin spoke this morning about how students have to do much more than interact with teachers, they have to interact with other people as well. So this is the real world domain of being a student, not just in the classroom as being a student. So then we need to think about, okay, so what do I actually cover? How do I figure out what I need to cover? And more to the point, how do I figure out what to test? And how do I even assess it? And these are some challenges that we have as EAP teachers, often because the people that we have in our class might be from different faculties, they might be studying different things, or they might actually be studying the same thing, but all at different levels. So we have potentially great challenges. If we're very, very lucky, we might have all the same people studying the same subject, all at the same level. And you may be very lucky and say, yeah, that's me. But it wasn't necessarily us, unfortunately. So what we need to do, the first thing to do is figure out a needs analysis. And to do this, we need to think about, and I've put it in italics, what do students of different subjects need to produce in writing or in speech? So not what information do they receive in, but what do they actually need to produce that their degree programme is based on and their assessment is based on. And these are just a few examples. So they might have to write essays, they might need to write business reports, lab reports, they might have to do applications for a practical, for example, if they have to go and do a semester in a company somewhere. They might have to do presentations, they'll almost certainly have to have discussions in seminars or at least talk to their lecturers. But as we saw already, they also have to go outside of the classroom and they might have to deal with admin staff as well. And a gazillion billion other things that they have to come up with. But let's go back to things like essays, reports, presentations, and so on. Where does that input come from? We don't just go, oh, today I'll write an essay on the Industrial Revolution 4.0 that we've heard about. We have to do research. We have to go back and get the input. So the source of the content for those outputs, and that's why I said what do they have to produce, the input can come from a number of different areas. It can come from visual information, for example, from pictures, graphs, videos, whatever. It can come from oral information. It might be from the lectures that they have from the content lecturers. Obviously, it's probably likely to come from written information, either from books, journals, or from the internet. And then the question is the information in the L1 or the L2? obviously English students studying in English in an English environment, they'll do it all in their L1. But again, we've talked this morning about EMI and people studying in different countries. They have different L2s. They might read in their L1 and translate it into their L2, or get the ideas and write about those in the L2. They might do everything in the L2. They might have a mixture. So there's always this input coming from different places. So that's sort of the EAP side. Let's move on to the CEFR. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the CEFR, as we've seen, and therefore you'll know that it's a common basis for the elaboration of language syllabuses, curriculums, guidelines, examinations, etc. across Europe. That was the original intention, but actually what we've seen is that it's become far more international than just Europe. It's being used in Japan, it's being used here in Russia, whether in the European side or the other side, the Far Eastern side. So it's become far more wide-reaching than just within sort of the 27 countries, or the 28, 27, depending on where we are with Brexit today, within the countries of Europe. And it focuses on what the students can do rather than what they can't do. That's also important. And that comes from, so I'm sure you're familiar with these bits. What you might not be so familiar with is the next bit. This focus on the can-do statements comes much more from the theoretical side of the CEFR. And it's based far more on a task-based or a socio-constructivist theory of language learning. It breaks language activities down into modes of communication. So we have receptive and productive skills, but we also have modes of communication. So we've got reception, which is a discrete skill that can be reading and listening. We have production as a discrete skill, writing or speaking. But then we also have interaction, which is an integrated skill, and we'll have a look at that in a moment, and mediation, which is an integrated skill. And that means this is just far more reflective of the TLU domain. So we might listen to something. You're listening to me now. I'm not asking you to contribute, but you're listening. We might listen to the radio in the morning. We might speak out to the world. For all I know, you might all be asleep and I'm talking to myself. But hopefully I'm talking to somebody. But we have these skills that can be discrete or they can be integrated. Hopefully, if I'm speaking to you, you're listening to me. If I ask you a question, you react. I saw that you were awake 5 minutes ago because I got some reaction. So that's a good thing. So this is far more reflective of what we call the TLU domain, the target language use domain. So that's the CEFR. And what we see is that we can represent it like this. We have reception going along the top, discrete skills. We have production as a discrete skill. We're not losing the discrete skills here. But what we also have is reception, so reading or listening, feeding into interaction, which feeds into production. So I hear something and I respond to you. We have an interaction, we have a spoken interaction. That's an integrated skill. We have mediation, where the reception goes to a sort of ether in the sky and comes out in a different format. It's an integrated skill. And when it comes out in that different format, oops, it goes on and it becomes an integrated skill for production. So all of these still exist in the old CEFR and in the new companion volume. That's important to remember. We're not getting rid of the reception and the production. Now, because we're focusing on mediation, I want you to just read this. This is the definition of mediation. The quote actually is in the new companion volume, but it was taken from the original CEFR, so that hasn't really changed. So what we can see is that mediation is about enabling